Okay, well, I don't want to keep you all day, and we have so much to talk about, so let's get started.
All
What
right.
should I call you? AG holder, Attorney General holder,
Your Highness.
Your Highness, you, hey, you.
Eric is fine. Eric is fine. How about
All
that?
right, well, Eric Holder, it's a real privilege to be able to talk to you at this very important moment in our nation's history. I guess the question is, where do we begin? We've seen so many things happen in recent months. I'm just curious on a personal level how you have been able to process what we are all witnessing.
It's a hard thing to process. And I don't think that we should process this as we process, changes in administration, differences in policies that happen as a result of the outcome of elections. What's happening now is not normal. It's not normal. I've served in the Justice Department under Republican as well as Democratic attorneys general. And what's going on, for instance, at the Justice Department now is unprecedented. And what you see this administration doing with regard to a whole range of things, attacking universities, attacking the media, attacking law firms. These are all the kinds of things that you would expect to see in a nation that is moving towards authoritarianism. And it's certainly inconsistent with who we say we are, as Americans, and what our system of government is supposed to be like. So it's a hard thing to process, but to the extent I've been able to, I put myself in opposition. And I think that's where everybody has to be. Unless we are forceful in our opposition, visible in our opposition, this administration will run roughshod over that which defines this nation and makes this nation exceptional.
I want to ask you about the Justice Department because I think for most outsiders, it is still kind of a mystery
Sure.
about how it works and functions and the people who are there. Can you describe what has been happening at the DOJ? Because I report on it piecemeal,
Right.
but can you tell us sort of holistically what is going on there and the impact of what's happening?
Well, you only have to look at kind of, some specific things to get a sense of what's going on there. The firing of career employees, that never happens. I started in the Justice Department when I got out of law school in the thing called the Public Integrity Section, which investigates corrupt politicians. And I tried cases, all around the country. At the end of the Biden administration, there were about 30 people in that section. Now there are four. The voting section in the Civil Rights Division had about 30, 35 employees, lawyers. It now has about 5. These people have been fired, moved to other positions, meaningless positions, or encouraged to take early buyouts and essentially kind of squeezed out. So the Justice Department is not doing things in a way that other Justice Departments under Republican or Democratic presidents or attorneys general, have ever done. The Justice Department has pulled itself away from cases that had already been filed in Texas with regard to some voting rights issues. Just pulled itself out of a case that had already been filed, and the Justice Department was participating in. And among the most disturbing things, Katie, is the fact that this Attorney General doesn't seem to understand that the Justice Department has to stand to some degree separate and apart from the White House. She views herself as Donald Trump's lawyer and views the Justice Department as an arm of the White House. And the best AGs are the ones who guard jealously the independence of the Justice Department, given the ability that the department has to deprive people of their liberty, of their property. And you can't make those decisions on the basis of political considerations. And that's my biggest fear. They will remake the department. They will move out people who are steeped in its traditions, and then simply do Donald Trump's bidding.
And all the king's horses and all the king's men will not be able to put it back together again, even when he leaves office, potentially.
That's a big concern. There is going to certainly have to be a rebuilding effort, but I think in some ways that is, for me, the silver lining. There's the potential here to not only rebuild, but to try to reimagine what government could look like. Not only the Justice Department, but other agencies as well. What should a 21st century Justice Department look like? You're going to be coming in 2029, I hope, a new attorney general looking at the carnage that would be left. And so maybe you just don't put people back in the same places in the same numbers, but you try to figure out, well, what is it that a 21st century Justice Department ought to be about, and you staff it up, you prioritize it with that in mind. That is that's what I try to think of as a silver lining. But make no mistake, between now and January of 2029, there's a lot of damage that's going to be done, not only to the Justice Department, but other executive branch agencies as well.
And it has already been done, right?
It has already been done. I mean, the kinds of things where you essentially dismantle, the Agency for International Development. It's kind of like, whoa, what? A congressionally mandated and funded agency that they simply closed down. The little knotheads at DOJ walking around and saying, for whatever reason, we're going to dismantle this agency which projects soft power for the United States.
Also, the people who are monitoring waste, fraud, and abuse, which is public enemy number one for the Trump administration.
Right.
The people who are charged
Right.
with investigating abuse have all been fired.
Right. The inspectors general, all but two let go. And so you can almost see how this is playing out. We'll remove all of the people who are supposed to monitor these kinds of things, all the folks who might be looking either outwardly or inwardly at potential matters of corruption. And so then we have a free hand to do that which we want to do.
You mentioned Pam Bondi's belief that she's Donald Trump's personal lawyer. I want to read a quote from The Guardian, which sums up, I think, the current state of the DOJ. Some say that the department has in effect become Trump's personal law firm. Since taking office a second time, Trump has relied on staunch loyalist Pam Bondi and an elite group of Justice Department lawyers to investigate critics from his first administration, plus political opponents and curb prosecutions of U.S. business bribery overseas. Ex-prosecutors point to how Bondi and the department's top lawyers have halted some major prosecutions, fired or forced out lawyers who didn't meet MAGA litmus tests, and were instructed by Trump to investigate a key Democratic fundraising vehicle as examples of how Trump and Bondi have politicized the Justice Department. You were President Obama's Attorney General for 6 years, from 2009 to 2015. I think the Justice Department, correct me if I'm wrong, has often been accused of being overly political. Sure. If you think about, RFK being the Attorney General for JFK, or Ed Meese, right, mm-hmm. and Ronald Reagan. And I think there's been criticisms that Merrick Garland was too careful and too apolitical and dragged his feet. But this is a whole new level of the politicization of the Department of Justice. And as you're watching this, I just wonder what you're thinking and how angry you're getting and how you're figuring out what can be done. As you mentioned, 2029, but it's a long way till then.
Yeah. It's not it's a harder thing to say, politicization, as opposed to what it is that they're doing, because they're politicizing the department and have done so relatively quickly. But they're not politicizing the Justice Department. They're weaponizing the Justice Department. They're using the Justice Department to get at the perceived enemies of the president. And they're not necessarily enemies. They are political opponents. They're critics, or people who potentially might have the capacity to oppose him in some ways. And so this is unbelievably disturbing. I mean, this is a cornerstone of our system of government, that you have a Justice Department that, although a part of an administration, still maintains a healthy dose of independence. Yeah, and AGs get criticized all the time for doing things that are perceived to be or said to be political. And most of the time, that's just political rhetoric. Justice departments that actually do things on the basis of politics are the ones that get in trouble. Those are the AGs who get indicted or who are not looked upon favorably by history. History is not going to be kind to Pam Bondi. History is not going to be kind to the people who serve under her in the Justice Department now, because they're doing things inconsistent with the best traditions of a department, an organization that means the world to me. I grew up in the Justice Department. I grew up in that place, out of law school, line lawyer, U.S. attorney, deputy attorney general, attorney general. Most of my career has been spent in the United States Department of Justice, and it tears me apart to see what they're doing in tearing apart that very institution.
Let me ask you about what's going on in Los Angeles, if I could, because obviously that is dominating the headlines right now. After several days of protest against immigration enforcement raised by ICE, as you well know, President Trump bypassed Governor Gavin Newsom and called up 4,000 National Guard troops and a battalion of 700 Marines to the city of Los Angeles. Legally and historically, how extraordinary is this move?
Legally, it's an interesting case as to, I think California has sued, and it'll be interesting to see exactly how the case plays out. But historically, this is something that runs counter to our traditions and counter to the practice that past presidents have used. When a president has called out the National Guard without the request of a governor, well, you think back to the 60s when I guess President Johnson called out the National Guard to protect the Selma to Montgomery marchers out of concern that George Wallace and the state troopers there who cracked John Lewis's head on the Selma on Edmund Pettus Bridge might not have the marchers' best interest at heart. So you can see something like that happening. Here, there's no basis to believe that the state and local authorities can't handle what's going on. I think this administration is itching for a fight. They want to do things that are going to antagonize people who are using their First Amendment rights to protest the immigration policies of the administration. They want pictures to show people in the streets doing, negative things. And to be fair, there are people who need to be held accountable. People who are throwing things at cops, people who are saying negative things to cops, physically confronting them.
Burning up cop cars and things like that.
Those people ought to be in jail. They're thugs, they're hooligans. They need to be in jail.
They're exploiting the situation.
Right. So there is that. But the vast majority of the people who are protesting are simply doing so in a peaceful way. Now, I don't, countenance people who are doing things that physically harm cops, that's block traffic on major thoroughfares. It's also, that's counterproductive at the end of the day. People waving flags of foreign nations. Think about this. I mean, if you want to get the American people on your side, and I think with regard to these immigration policies, the American people are appalled at what this administration is doing, but they're also kind of pushed back by some of the tactics that are being used by some of these demonstrators. But this is all political. I mean, to put, to call up National Guardsmen and then to call up Marines. Now, these Marines do a great job at what it is that they do. I would bet that crowd control is not something that the United States Marine Corps is trained to do. And so that's just an incendiary kind of thing that Whiskey Pete and Donald Trump have decided that they want to do.
Do you think they're intentionally trying to escalate the tension and create chaos instead of diffusing it?
Absolutely. They want to antagonize, escalate, and get the pictures that they want, which is to show, people hurling things, setting cars afire, blocking traffic, doing all those kinds of things to try to convince people, as Stephen Miller said, that there's a war of civilizations going on. What the hell does that mean? Really? I mean, you're trying to, we got criticized, President Obama was criticized for being the deporter in chief. If you look at what it is that we did, we used the courts to get people who had recently come to the United States, the immigration courts, get them out, and then we went after people who committed serious crimes. We didn't take 4-year-old girls who were potentially going to die and deport them to Mexico. We didn't take people who'd been here. There was a waitress, I think, in Missouri, been here for 20 years, pull her out of her, place of employment and try to send her back. This is an administration that views certain immigrants in certain ways. If these people were trying to get in from Norway, from Sweden, from Finland, from Northern European countries. Any problem with that, I bet. Afrikaners, yeah, we're letting those folks in from South Africa. But if you happen to be Hispanic, if you happen to be a person from Haiti, from African countries, we don't want those people. They don't want those people in this country, and that's kind of the underpinnings of their immigration policy, and that's why Miller talks about this clash of civilizations.
So you think it's racism, pure and simple?
Not pure and simple, but there's a component to that. I mean, racism, ethnicism, I guess, that you might call it. Yeah, I mean, you'd have to be reluctant to look at that which is fairly obvious, I mean, you send a plane to get, I don't know, was it 50, 60 Afrikaners out of South Africa? You insult the president of South Africa.
You show a photo from Congo?
From Congo. That's got nothing to do with South Africa. It's all laying a predicate for the kinds of things that they want to do with our immigration system. Again, inconsistent with how America has always said it is, and by and large, how we've always conducted ourselves when it comes to immigration. At the beginning of the 20th century, it was Italians and Irish who were negative things were said about, and they tried to keep them out of the country. Chinese Exclusion Act. No, these are not great moments in American history, and I fear that we are replicating that in the 21st century under this administration.
What's frustrating to me is it shows the inability of our government to actually tackle a problem.
Right.
There should have been comprehensive immigration reform long ago, and yet time and time again, it never is able to gain traction.
Yeah.
And we need a fair, humane immigration system in this country.
Right.
And why can't Congress, why can't they come up with a better plan that is fair to people, but also involves laws?
Yeah. I mean, the President Bush, George W. Bush, certainly tried.
Right. Kennedy and McCain tried
Kennedy
together.
McCain, Senator Langford from Oklahoma came up with a bill that, made people on the other side, Democrats, swallow hard, but said, we'll support that. And what happened? Donald Trump said, no, don't vote for that. He wants the issue. This is a central part of his administration. It's been a central part of his campaigns. When he rode down that golden escalator to announce his candidacy back in, I guess, 2015, he talked about, Mexicans are rapists. They're not sending us their best. This has been a part of his shtick, and he'd rather have the issue than the solution. But you're right. I mean, we have got to come to grips with the fact that we have millions of undocumented people here who have contributed, mightily, who pay taxes, who pay Social Security taxes, who are part of the fabric of this nation. They need to be treated fairly, but at the same time also recognize that borders mean something, and we can't take all of El Salvador and all of Guatemala and all of Honduras into the United States. There are processes that people have to go through. If they don't follow those processes, well, as we did in the Obama administration, they need to be removed. But there is the need for, and there has been the need for, comprehensive immigration reform for decades at this point.
Having said that, this is not the solution to just, in a very draconian and inhumane way, take people who have been in this country, as you said, who are paying taxes, money's going into the Social Security system, who are actually really important for our economy. 48% of agricultural workers are undocumented. And, look at the nation's hotels, and you look at all kinds of workers. I think I heard there were 1 million undocumented workers in Los Angeles.
Right.
If all of these people are forced out of the country, it's going to have a huge impact on the economy, is it not?
Yeah, it's going to have a huge impact on the economy. There are certain industries that rely a great deal on immigrant labor, from meat packing in Iowa to people who are picking crops in Florida and in California. But, we're also turning our back on our immigrant past. And here's the deal. everybody who's listening to this or watching this, you're an immigrant stock unless you are descended from the Native American people. If you're the waspiest person in the world, if you can trace your roots to the Mayflower, guess what? Those folks who came over here were immigrants. They were fleeing religious persecution, and it's just a question of how you got here and when you got here. And it's always seems to be that the latest are the ones who get vilified, and then they become, assimilated into our society, and then they're fine. And so, Trump and his folks are trying to recreate an America that really never existed, a 1950s America, where June Cleaver was vacuuming in high heels and in pearls. There white picket fences, no gay people, no black people. Women
making an after-school snack for Beaver,
Right.
Wally, and
Lumpy.
Eddie, and Lumpy,
and Eddie Haskell.
and Eddie Haskell,
Eddie Haskell. Let's not
who
forget him.
said, "Thank you, Mrs.
Thank
Cleaver."
you, Mrs. Cleaver. He's my man. I love that guy.
I mean, we're clearly the same generation here.
Eddie was the man. Eddie was definitely the man.
He was such a kiss ass. I couldn't stand him.
Oh, I love that guy.
I was a lumpy girl.
Oh, Lumpy Rutherford. Okay, all right.
Anyway, we digress.
Oh, this is important stuff,
I wanted to ask you, Eric, about Kilmar Garcia, who was wrongly deported to El Salvador earlier this year despite a court order barring his removal. So finally he comes home, right? And now he's facing these newly unsealed federal charges. I am so confused by this. Can you help me out?
Well, I think we're all a little confused by that. The administration was confused by that when they said that, well, we deported this guy, whoops, by mistake. And
they showed a photoshopped picture
Right.
of his fingers.
Right. Well, they supposedly had tattoos that tied him to a gang. Trump looked at it and said, no, that's not doctored. And it's like, yes, it is. But, all right. So, yeah, they were confused. And they removed him without due process.
Well, I wanted to ask you about due process. But first, before I do and jump ahead, what is going on with this man?
Well, he's finally back in the United States. He's now facing charges that appear to have been uncovered relatively recently. I read that a prosecutor has resigned in the Justice Department as a result of the actions that have been taken against this now defendant, Mr. Garcia.
Is this a face-saving measure, in your view?
I don't know about the strength of the case, but it does seem a little suspicious that these charges are now brought, and they use that as the basis to get him, from that hellhole in El Salvador back to, the United States, when they could quite simply have told, President Bukele, give us this guy. And if the American government had said that, he would have shown up in the United States. So we'll see. I mean, we'll see how these charges go, and we'll have an ability to judge whether or not this was a pretext or whether there is a real basis to conclude that he violated the law in the ways in which the government has delineated in an indictment.
Why is due process so important?
Due process is one of the foundational parts of our society. Government power can only be used against individuals in prescribed ways. Due process means that you have the ability to challenge a governmental action that's directed at you, whether it is an attempt to take property from you, to imprison you. The government has to be put to its proof before it can actually act. And what we've seen with so many of these deportations is that people have simply been snatched off the street, put on airplanes, and then moved to El Salvador, South Sudan, Libya, without any ability for these people to say, well, wait a minute, why am I being taken away? Prove to me what's the legitimate basis for this action. And people need to understand, governments make mistakes. I think about that gay makeup artist. That guy, I mean, as best I can tell, he's taken because of tattoos that he had on his hands that apparently were misinterpreted. I don't know where this poor man is at this point. And I know he got to El Salvador. I don't know what has happened, to him. There's really no basis for his deportation as best I can tell. And yet, because he didn't have due process, he didn't have the ability to challenge that which the government wanted to do to him. He was simply picked up, put on a plane, and then taken down to, that place in El Salvador.
And then I think about how sort of capricious it is when someone is basically let go, like that waitress in Missouri when there was that community outcry, or
Right.
the 4-year-old girl who needed life-saving medical care. But how many people are out there like them who don't necessarily have a community
Right.
or a citizenry rising up and defending them?
Yeah. I mean, that's both the concern I have. I mean, how many other people are like that? And that's also the thing that gives me some degree of optimism and shows the power of the American people. When that community in Missouri said, no, you're not taking her, what happened? Lo and behold, she reappears. When the media does the great job that they did to publicize the case of that poor 4-year-old girl, cute as a button. What happens? Well, suddenly, okay, she can stay here for medical treatment that basically keeps her alive. The power of the media, the power of the American people cannot be underestimated, and you can't overestimate the power of government when those two forces are in opposition. And that's why it's incumbent upon the American people to be conversant with what's going on, to be active, to be engaged, and be committed to defending our values. And the media can't be cowed. The media can't be cowed.
Has it been?
To some degree, I think so. There's a desire, it's a human thing, to look at situations and to try to look at both sides, normalize things.
Be fair.
And sometimes you've got to, call them as they are. I mean, if I'm sitting here with you, I'm a Democrat, you're a Republican, and we're in the middle of a hurricane, and I'm a Democrat, and I says, look, it's raining outside. You, the Republicans, say, no, it's sunny outside, but there's a hurricane going on. The reporters there can't simply say, well, the Republicans said that there was no rain, the Democrats said that there was rain. End of analysis. No, you got to say the Republican was unbelievably wrong because, in fact, there was a hurricane out there. And I think that probably makes some in the media a little uncomfortable because
Well, I think when you try to search for the truth, and I can talk about this,
better than me.
very, very personally, that you're often accused of being biased.
Right.
And if you actually just want to present facts and you are searching for truth, that is not being biased.
Right.
I have so many people saying to me, Eric, what happened to you?
Yeah.
And I said, nothing happened to me. Maybe it's what has happened to our country.
Yeah. And that's the deal. You've got to be prepared to deal with those charges of bias if what you are carefully reporting is truth. In the same way that I was talking about before, those congressmen, you've got to act in a way that's consistent with your oath, even if that means you're going to be charged with being disloyal,
Or
or
you're
it's going to
gonna be
cost your career, you're
primaried.
going to be primaried, you're going to be called a rhino,
Or
whatever it
Elon
is.
Musk is going to
Right.
support your opposition, although that's a kind of a mess too now.
Right. I mean, and universities have got to be prepared, to take on forces that are doing things inconsistent with the way in which universities are supposed to conduct themselves, and it may cost you money. Okay, you got to be prepared for that. Opposition, effective opposition, does not come without a price. The reporting of truth frequently does not come without a price. We've seen this throughout our history where, brave news gatherers have lost their lives reporting the truth. And we dishonor them. People in the media dishonor them if we are not willing, members of the media, are not willing to report truthfully now. And we've got to be supportive. We, the American people, have to be supportive of people in the media who have the guts to do exactly that. Focus on truth.
Getting back to Los Angeles, I wanted to ask you about this Posse Comitatus Act. I feel like I've gotten a law degree in the last few days, Eric. It's an 1878 law that generally bars the U.S. military from engaging in civilian law enforcement. And a lot of people are saying, hey, Donald Trump, you cannot deploy the National Guard or Marines to do the job of law enforcement. This is
Yeah.
this is not right.
Right.
So does this law or this act not have any teeth?
Yeah, well, that's why they're trying to characterize it as the use of the military for national security purposes. I mean, they understand that posse comitatus is a big problem if the military is to be engaged in domestic law enforcement. So they're trying to characterize it as anything but that, and so they have to, say negative things about the protesters, that they are not only protesting inappropriately, but they're also a threat to national security, and in that way, they think they can justify the use of the military.
Are they also claiming that of the undocumented people who they're apprehending, that they're a threat to national security?
Yeah, I mean that's certainly the claim, and that's why they try to make use of the military there to the extent that they possibly can.
How did you like the fact that these protesters are being called insurrectionists?
You know,
A word that was never used on January 6th.
right? Yeah, it's there's a whole bunch of stuff here that's a little hypocritical. You call these folks insurrectionists, these protesters, and they're doing that which the vast majority. Now there are exceptions, but the vast majority is simply doing that which is guaranteed by our First Amendment. The people who stormed our Capitol on January the 6th were worthy of pardons. And when I hear people in this administration talk about how they want to protect the police, I think, well, wait a minute. What were you all doing when you pardoned all those people who beat the hell out of cops on the Capitol steps and in the Capitol on January the 6th? What were you trying to do with the blue there? What were you trying to do with regard to police officers when you decided that those true insurrectionists were deserving of pardons?
So is he using that terminology to set himself up to use the Insurrection Act? And can you explain what that means?
Well, that's a concern that I have, that the possibility exists that which we've seen now is really just a prelude, a foundation for the imposition of the Insurrection Act, which gives a president really broad-ranging powers to do a whole range of things. But to declare an insurrection means you got to meet there are a number of requirements. I don't think those are met. I suspect they probably will not be met.
Will he use it anyway?
Well, that's what worries me. I mean, if you had asked me that question even 6-7 months ago, I would have said, Katie, you're being a little alarmist here. You're being hyperbolic. And now I can't dismiss that. I mean, I really can't. David Frum wrote a piece in The Atlantic, I think, last week or so, where he talked about the possibility that the Insurrection Act might be used to somehow tinker with the 2026 midterms. And again, that's the kind of thing that I would have read 5-6 months ago and thought, that's just nuts. And now I think we have to be prepared. I still don't think it happens. I think the 2026 elections will go on and they'll be fine. But I think we have to at least be prepared for the possibility that some attempt might be made to fool around with elections in certain parts of the country. And the fact that I even say that as a former attorney general, that we have to be prepared for that possibility, is something that's extremely alarming.
You talked earlier about the Justice Department being gutted, and I'm wondering who is there or who will protect the rights of these protesters to exercise their First Amendment rights, the right to assemble, the right to free speech. If the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department has been, dismantled essentially, who will stand up for these people?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think there are a couple of sources. You've certainly got state attorneys general and state lawyers who can protect the rights of these folks. And then there's the private bar, which is why, when law firms cut these deals with the administration, that's why that was so troubling. It sends a chill out among other law firms who might decide to be the lawyers for these protesters. And now they know, well, if we get crosswise with this administration, maybe we will be the subject of an executive order. And so that is one of the reasons why you go after the law firms, because you reduce the possibility that your opponents will have adequate legal representation. So yeah, the Justice Department's not going to help an awful lot, but there are still lots of lawyers in different places, both in government and on the private side, that can can come to their assistance.
Having said that, has the legal system been effectively weakened or diminished as a result of Donald Trump's actions?
I would say it's been diminished or weakened in certain ways. I worry about what's happened to big law firms and their reactions to some of these executive orders. And so I think there's been some weakness shown there. I think the courts have generally done extremely well. He has lost the overwhelming number of cases that have been brought before federal judges. So I think the system is held there. My concern there is that we're at the district court level. Courts have held. I think at the Court of Appeals level, the courts will hold. The question is what ultimately is going to happen at the United States Supreme Court. And there, I get a little concerned about with their expansive view of executive power. And that you look at that immunity decision from the last term. Will that view of executive power allow the Trump administration to do the kinds of things that they are trying to do? Will the Supreme Court give them, the authority to do things that I think are clearly inconsistent with our traditions, our norms, and our laws?
Do you think the Supreme Court, have you gotten any kind of encouragement by some of their decisions, by some of the justices seeming to not walk lockstep with the president?
Yeah. I think I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. I think I'm concerned about and see what the Supreme Court does, but I think that there is certainly a basis for hope that the Supreme Court will act in the way that Court of Appeals judges are acting, the way district court judges have been acting. But it's not the sure thing that I think it ought to be. That immunity decision can't be undervalued. To make up out of whole cloth the notion that an American president
is above the law.
Can violate the law, can direct people in his administration to do certain things without any kind of criminal liability. That's where'd that come from? Where's that? They talk about originalism, textualism. Where's that in any of the texts?
And then the question is, what will keep the administration from ignoring any decisions made by the courts? I was disturbed to see that part of this budget bill, there was a provision that would prevent judges from issuing contempt of court orders, forcing people to basically obey their decisions, in essence, right?
Right.
And that is in the small print of this budget bill. That is adding to this whole notion of immunity in a significant way, is it not?
Yeah, and that's why this, what they call it, the big, beautiful bill, has got to be examined page by page. I have problems with, the continuation of the tax cuts, which were, I think, unnecessary. But you also have to look at those kinds of provisions, though they're just kind of tucked away there. They recognize the power that the courts have and the power the district court judges have, and they're trying to decrease that power. They're trying to systematically eliminate all those areas, all those places where they might run into opposition. And that's the thing that worries me. What's the end game here? If you take lawyers out of the mix, if you take the media out of the mix, if you take universities out of the mix, if you take power away from judges.
There are no guardrails.
This is all to what end? At the end of the day, what is it that you're trying to do? And that's
Well, you tell me. What do you think they're trying to do?
I worry. Are they trying to find ways in which they perpetuate themselves in power in ways that are inconsistent with our Constitution? Are they trying to make sure that elections can be conducted in such a way that they can guarantee a result, regardless of what the American people want to do? One of the things I've been fighting is this whole question of racial and partisan gerrymandering. Do they want to somehow use gerrymandering, knowing that they've flattened the opposition, and then gerrymander things in such a way so that they can guarantee Republican domination of our state legislatures, Republican domination of our United States House of Representatives, because there are no checks. So that's at least one of the ways in which I get concerned about what it is they might do.
Tell us more about the work you're doing to address your concerns.
Yeah, I mean, as President Obama and I were leaving office, we tried to.
You can call him Barack.
Yeah, he's my good buddy, Bo. As we were leaving office, we tried to figure out what is it we want to do in our post-government lives. What is the thing that we thought would pose some of the greatest problems that we had to confront? And we pointed to the issue of gerrymandering. And so we formed up the National Democratic Redistricting Committee that really looks at the way in which the lines are drawn for state legislative seats as well as the United States House of Representatives, and said, you know what, here's the deal. Let's just make that process fair. Let's do away with gerrymandering, which guarantees that Republicans are going to win in certain districts, Democrats are going to win in certain districts. Let's just make it fair so that politicians are not picking their voters. Voters are choosing who their representatives ought to be. And so we've had a pretty good amount of success. And to give you a sense of how
How do you stop gerrymandering?
Well, there's a number of things. You bring lawsuits where you find gerrymanders. You put in place these independent commissions to draw the lines instead of interested politicians. And then you also support candidates who will stand for a fair process. And I mean, to give you a sense, Katie, of how bad it was, you look at the election right after the gerrymanders that were put in place in 2011 and 2012 congressional elections. Democrats got 1.4 million more votes for the United States House of Representatives in 2012, and it ended up with a 33-seat deficit. And it's all a function of the way in which the gerrymanders were put in place. When we started out, Democrats to have a 50-50 U.S. House of Representatives had to overperform by 8%. Now, we wiped that out, and we had the most fair elections in terms of gerrymandering, the lack of gerrymandering, I guess, in 2022, but there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. 2022, 2024, we saw things much better than they were in 2012, but there are still a lot of places, Texas, Georgia, Wisconsin, Florida, Louisiana, still places where there's work to be done.
There's also a Supreme Court case, Louisiana versus Calais,
right,
which asks whether creating a second majority black district, something ordered under the Voting Rights Act, violates the Equal Protection Clause. Critics say this case could gut what's left of Section 2. Okay, I just said that. I have no idea what that means. Will you explain?
Yeah, I mean, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act allows private parties, as well as Justice Department, to challenge unfair voting practices, on the basis of race. If you look at the way in which the lines have been drawn in southern states, where there's a history of racially polarized voting, that's a critical thing. There's a history of racially polarized voting. Those parties that have substantial African American support have been discriminated against. That's the Democratic Party, say, in Alabama. And so we brought a lawsuit there. This very conservative Supreme Court said, you know what? Black folks make up about 27% of the population. Based on the number of congressmen you have, there should be 2 black opportunity districts. There was only one. We won the case.
What is a black opportunity district?
It's a district that is created so that the African American population in a particular area has the ability to express its political will, so that if you want to elect a black person as a congressman or as a congresswoman, you have that ability. The lines are not drawn in such a way that precludes that possibility and undermines the ability of that 27% of the population to fully express their political desires. And so after our successful suit that the Supreme Court upheld, surprising to me, but got to give them credit, they helped. We have now for the first time 2 black congressmen from Alabama, consistent again with the population demographics of the city, of the state, and also taking into consideration something people have to keep in mind, that history of racially polarized voting. Without that, Section 2 is not necessarily a tool that we can use. And so we've used that now in Louisiana as well. And now the Louisiana folks who didn't like the result are claiming that white people are being discriminated against by the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and they wanted to have that declared unconstitutional or rip away from the Voting Rights Act the constitutionality of Section 2, using some of the same arguments that were used when the act was put in place back in 1965.
You warned that what we're seeing in the U.S. today is, quote, remarkably similar to what happened in Europe in the 30s, and you've drawn comparisons to places like Hungary and Turkey. Do you think Americans grasp what serious trouble we are in, and how the future may in fact look? I mean, I worry about that all the time too.
Yeah. People don't get it to the degree that they should now, and that concerns me a great deal. But I think there's a growing awareness among people as you see these demonstrations breaking out, not only in Los Angeles, but in other parts of the country, and you see the size of them growing. I think there's a growing awareness of that. The American people are generally slow to rouse, but once aroused, they are a mighty force. And that's something that we can never forget. All the great movements in this nation came about not because politicians decided it was time for women to get the right to vote. It was time for a system of American apartheid to be taken down. It was because the American people said, you know what, it's not fair that women can't vote. This system of segregation, that's just not fair, and that needs to be torn down. That's the power of the American people. And I think there is a growing awareness that fundamental liberties, fundamental rights, fundamental notions of who we are as a people and how we should be governed are being trampled. And so I am optimistic that at the end of the day, the American people will get to the right place, and I think do so, in time. That's the thing that gives me optimism.
There's no guarantee that democracies last, is there?
No. Democracy is an extremely fragile thing. If you look at Europe in the 20s and the 30s, fascism, communism didn't rise because they were strong. They rose because democracy was weak. The Weimar Republic, weak. Kerensky, in Russia, weak. So Lenin takes over, Hitler takes over. And I think unless we make sure that our democracy is strong, the possibility that something similar to what has happened in Europe in the 30s, or more recently in Hungary and in Turkey, could happen here in the United States as well.
Do you think your good friend Barack is speaking out enough and warning enough people? And what about former presidents like George W. Bush? He cannot be happy with what is going on, and yet he's been pretty much silent. And I know there's a great tradition of former presidents not criticizing or opining on current presidents, but have you been disappointed that Barack Obama isn't saying and doing more, and that George W. Bush isn't saying much either? I'm not mentioning Bill Clinton because I think he's been speaking out a little bit more, but I'm not sure. But could they get together and in a bipartisan way talk about the dangers we're facing here?
Yeah, in some ways that would be an ideal situation, but I do think that the criticism of President Obama is not necessarily well-founded. I mean, he, gave a great speech at Hamilton College. He's worked with us at the NDRC. I've gotten him to endorse candidates at the state and local level to try to make sure that the underpinnings of our democracy get the appropriate amount of attention. He has used the power that he still has, I think, in a judicious way. You speak out too much, and then you just become part of the noise. And so I think he's got to pick his spots, and I think he has done so quite well. The thing that gets me, though, is that people are always saying, well, why are the Democrats not doing this? Why is Obama not doing this? Well, people need to ask, where the hell are the damn Republicans? They're the ones with the power. It's their president. They control the Senate. They control the House. They've got, you might argue, control of the judiciary. Where are the Republicans here? Where's the opposition from the Republicans? I know these folks don't think that the things that the Trump administration is doing, the things that they're doing are appropriate, constitutional, consistent with our values. and it's crickets from them. You know, they're afraid, politically afraid. Some say physically afraid. But
Is it really that much fun to be a member of Congress that they just can't part with their jobs to actually do the right thing?
You know, it seems to me that you got to take these jobs and be prepared to separate yourself from the job if it means that you're asked to do something inconsistent with your oath. When you're Attorney General, you get to put up the portraits of 4 of your predecessors in the big conference room. And one of the people I put up was Elliot Richardson. I had him off to the left, so I'd always see him. And he was there to remind me that, you know, you may have to do something that goes contrary to, I didn't expect this to happen, but contrary to what somebody in the White House wants you to do, and it may cost you your job. But that's why Elliot Richardson was a hero to me, because when Richard Nixon told him, you know, to fire the Watergate special prosecutor, he said, I'm not doing that. And as a result, you know, he lost his job. That's the kind of attitude that people in Congress need to have. Take actions that may cost you your seat, but maybe it won't cost you your seat if enough of you come together and say, you know, we stand for principle over party. We stand for patriotism over the concerns of the Republican Party.
And maybe the American people appreciate and respect elected leaders who feel that they're doing the right thing. Maybe they'll actually, to your point, be rewarded for that, not penalized.
See, I think that's right. I think people underestimate the sagacity of the American people, you know?
I like that word, sagacity.
Yeah, I hope I used it right.
I think you did.
The
wisdom.
Yeah, there we go. And if it wasn't, we'll just do this part over. But no, I mean, you know, the American people, I think, respect authenticity. They respect strength. They respect people who are willing to take chances. And yeah, that's what maybe Republicans would have to do, but the chances they have to take are political ones. And that's not too much to ask. You know, you swore an oath to the Constitution, not to a man.
Eric Holder, I am so appreciative of your time. Thank you. This interview was a long time coming.
All right.
We had difficult time scheduling
Well,
it.
your schedule is such, you know, you're a busy woman. I'm like semi-retired. I could have been here almost any time, you know?
Our schedules just weren't aligning, but I'm so grateful that they finally have. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. It was fun.